This is Chthoniya, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthoniya, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. My name's Breach Burke, I'm your host. This week we're going to talk about Cerridwen. Now, Cerridwen is a rather she's an interesting figure in the sense that it's not clear whether she's a goddess, whether she's a magician, enchantress. I mean, she's certainly definitely that latter thing. Whether she's also considered to be an ancient Celtic deity or not is not entirely clear. She does seem to be a deity in modern Wicca, and is often associated with this idea of the triple moon goddess, and she tends to be associated with the waning or crone aspect of the moon. This probably is not, I feel like this is a later attribution that's put onto her. I don't really think that's what, you can certainly make the case that Cerridwen has to do with this sort of dark magical energy, which is why we're discussing her today. But some of the other pieces of it, I'm not entirely sure about. Nonetheless, what is very clear is that Cerridwen, she is, I'm going to read this little description of her. She is an enchantress in Welsh medieval legend. She was the mother of a hideous son called Morfran and a beautiful daughter called Cerridwen. I think I'm saying that right. Welsh is another one of those languages that trips me up, but I'll do my best. It says her husband was Tigid Foyle, and they lived near Bala Lake in the north of Wales. Medieval Welsh poetry refers to her as possessing a cauldron of poetic inspiration called Awen, and the tale of Talisin recounts her swallowing her servant Gwion Bach, who was then reborn as the poet Talisin. And of course, Cerridwen is regarded by many modern pagans as the Celtic goddess of rebirth, transformation, and inspiration. Okay. So we see her as this figure. She's often portrayed as an old woman or as an old hag in a lot of things. Again, probably because of this croning aspect. And the aspect of the cauldron is pretty important too. So what I want to discuss today about her, first I want to talk about the main legend associated with her, which is in the Mabinogion, the Welsh epic. It's one of the last stories that at least is listed in the translated copy that I have. And that story of Gwion Bach and the story of Talisin is the main story. And the Cerridwen story actually serves as the basis of a lot of the King Arthur legend as well. So it is fairly well known in different forms to other people, although parts of it tend to get mixed together, maybe that weren't intentionally meant to be mixed together, or at least certain things are confused. So I'm going to talk about that in that main writing, and then also where she's mentioned in other places historically. And I'll talk a little bit about the Graves and Wicca connection to her as well. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the cauldron, and its meaning in terms of underworld and in terms of its relationship to the underworld and to things like prophecy and inspiration and so forth. And that'll probably be the extent of what I discuss. So let me begin here. I've just given you sort of a little background as to who she is. I would actually like to read you the story from the translated Mabinogion. The Lady Charlotte Guest, this is her translation of the story. And it's listed as the story of Taliesin. Okay, so I'm going to read this. I may skip over some Welsh names if I don't think they're necessary, simply because I don't want to insult my Welsh friends with some of the pronunciation. Okay. In times past, there lived a man of gentle lineage, named Tigid Foyle, and his dwelling was in the midst of the lake Tigid, and his wife was called Cerridwen. And there was born to him of his wife a son named Morfran ab Tegid, and also a daughter named Cerridwen. The fairest maiden in the world was she, and they had a brother, the most ill-favored man in the world, Avatu. Now, Cerridwen, his mother, thought that he was not likely to be admitted among men of noble birth by reason of his ugliness, unless he had some exalted merits or knowledge. For this was at the beginning of Arthur's time and of the Round Table. So she resolved, according to the arts of the books of the, okay, I'm going to say Fairlit, but I'm not sure that's right, to boil a cauldron of inspiration and science for her son, that his reception might be honorable because of his knowledge of the mysteries of the future state of the world. Then she began to boil the cauldron, from which the beginning of its boiling might not cease to boil for a year and a day, until 3 blessed drops were obtained of the grace of inspiration. And she put Gwion Bach to stir the cauldron, and a blind man named Morda to kindle the fire beneath it. And she charged them that they should not suffer it to cease boiling for the space of a year and a day. And she herself, according to the books of the astronomers and in planetary hours, gathered every day of all charm-bearing herbs. And one day, toward the end of the year, as Cerridwen was culling plants and making incantations, it chanced that 3 drops of the charmed liquor flew out of the cauldron and fell upon the finger of Gwion Bach. And by reason of their great heat, he put his finger in his mouth, and the instant he put those marvel-working drops in his mouth, he foresaw everything that was to come, and perceived that his chief care must be to guard against the wiles of Cerridwen, for vast was her skill. And in very great fear he fled towards his own land, and the cauldron burst in 2, because all the liquor within it, except the 3 charm-bearing drops, was poisonous, so that the horses of Gwydno Garanhir were poisoned by the water of the stream into which the liquor of the cauldron ran. And the confluence of that stream was called the poison of the horses of Gwydno, or Gwithno, actually, from that time forth. Thereupon came in Cerridwen, and saw all of the toil of the whole year lost. And she seized a billet of wood and struck the blind Morda on the head until one of his eyes fell out upon his cheek. And he said, "Wrongfully hast thou disfigured me, for I am innocent. Thy loss was not because of me." "Thou speakest the truth," said Cerridwen. "It was Gwion Bach who robbed me." And she went forth after him running, and he saw her, and changed himself into a hare, and fled. But she changed herself into a greyhound, and turned him. And he ran towards a river, and became a fish. She, in the form of an otter bitch, chased him under the water, until he was fain to turn himself into a bird of the air. She, as a hawk, followed him, and gave him no rest in the sky. And just as she was about to stoop upon him, and he was in fear of death, he espied a heap of winnowed wheat on the floor of a barn, and he dropped among the wheat, and turned himself into one of the grains. Then she transformed herself into a high-crested black hen, and went to the wheat, and scratched it with her feet, and found him out, and swallowed him. And as the story says, she bore him 9 months, and when she was delivered of him, she could not find it in her heart to kill him, by reason of his beauty. So she wrapped him in a leathern bag, and cast him into the sea to the mercy of God, on the 29th day of April. And by the way, that day is important, because it's the day before for what they call Walpurgis Night, or May Eve. And at that time, the weir of Gwydno was on the strand between... let me hang on 1 minute here. Okay. Was on the strand between Divi and Aberystwyth, near to his own castle, and the value of £100 was taken in that weir every May Eve. And in those days Gwydno had an only son named Elphin, the most hapless of youths, and the most needy. And it grieved his father sore, for he thought he was born in an evil hour. And by the advice of his council, his father granted him the drawing of the weir that year, to see if good luck would ever befall him, and give him something wherewith to begin the world. And the next day, when Elphin went to look, there was nothing in the weir. But as he turned back, he perceived the leathern bag upon a pole of the weir. Then said one of the weirwan unto Elphin, "Thou was never unlucky until tonight, and now thou hast destroyed the virtues of the weir, which always yielded the value of £100 every May Eve, and tonight there is nothing but this leathern skin within it." "How now," said Elphin, "there may be therein the value of £100. Well, they took up the leathern bag, and he who opened it saw the forehead of the boy, and said to Elphin, "Behold, a radiant brow." "Taliesin be he called," said Elphin. And Taliesin, by the way, means radiant brow. And he lifted the boy in his arms, and lamenting his mischance, he placed him sorrowfully behind him. And he made his horse amble gently, that had before been trotting, and he carried him as softly as if he had been sitting in the easiest chair in the world. And presently the boy made a consolation and praise to Elphin, and foretold honor to Elphin. Okay, I'm not going to read the rest of it. But what happens is he then, Taliesin, this child, now begins to show, as an infant, his magical and bardic abilities. And so he recites this long poem to Elfin. And when Elfin brings him back to his father's, to the father's house, he gives him to the child to his wife to take care of. But the child prophesizes for him and says, that, not to worry about not getting the finding the 100 pounds, worth of gold or money or whatever, that they would gain much more than that. So, of course, by raising him, Elfin became very wealthy and then became sort of a king in his own right. And then there's another story in which, let me say it, Maelgwn Gwynedd takes him to, let me see if I can find the story here. Maelgwn Gwynedd, he is the king, and Elfin, boasts that he has, a bard who is greater than the other bards, and and a wife who is, of course, as virtuous as the king's wife, or just as, or more virtuous. And so, of course, as it is in a lot of these tales that come out of Wales and Ireland and different places, this kind of boasting always angers the king, who then throws the boaster in jail and demands that they prove the boast. And so they they end up devising a trick in any case, not only to prove the virtuousness of the wife, but then Taliesin actually goes to Maelgwyn's castle and manages to silence all of the bards. Like, he makes them unable to speak, and then he actually goes and recites his own poetry, thus proving himself to be the greatest bard. So, and so Taliesin, a lot of times he becomes, as this bard, and he becomes, supposedly he is a bard of several different kings. Now, from what I'm reading here about Taliesin, we're talking about the 6th century CE. Okay, so we're talking about the 500s. And so he was actually, there was supposed to be a Taliesin, an early Brittonic poet, they said, of sub-Roman Britain, whose work possibly has survived in a Middle Welsh manuscript called the Book of Taliesin. And he was believed to have sung in the court of at least 3 kings. And of course, King Arthur is the most well-known of these. Now, frequently there is a connection shown between Taliesin and Merlin. And I don't want to digress too much into that story, but it's I'm just looking here. I have a note on this, but let's see. Taliesin was often compared to Merlin. This is actually from the Mythopedia, the famous magician of King Arthur's court. Both men were wise and far-seeing, serving Arthur as advisor and magician, respectively. Though some legends depicted the two as practically interchangeable, they were ultimately separate characters with unique personal histories. Whereas Merlin was a druid and sometimes, treated as a half-demon, Taliesin was merely a twice-born bard. Whereas Merlin was famous for his fantastical nature, appearing in French romances and other tales of popular legend, Taliesin was more grounded in historical reality. And it's said that he bears similarities to the Irish and pan-Celtic figure of Lugh. Lugh, of course, is a god of skill and competency, who served as a bard in the court of King Dwada of the Silver Hand. And Lugh, of course, is sort of a tricksterish figure, as Taliesin is, because that sort of goes along with this idea of inspiration. So, but he is frequently overlaps with Merlin and is confused with Merlin in some writings. Now, the one thing though is that it is pretty clear that Taliesin is this bard. He has this gift of being able to sing and also to see the future. Okay, but the problem with Taliesin is that but nonetheless, he's also one of the gifts that comes out of the cauldron of inspiration from the 3 drops that Gwion Bach ingested by sucking on his fingers. That was also the ability to shapeshift, and we see that very clearly demonstrated in the story here, because he's trying to run away and he changes into all these different shapes. So it's not the Taliesin. I mean, now it could be that the historical Taliesin is a bard, is a famous bard singer, wrote famous poetry. But nonetheless, it's not it's not incorrect to say that in his tale that he also has magical abilities, particularly shape-shifting abilities, something that we generally associate with tricksters, which would be another reason that you could compare him to Lu in that sense. Okay, now I don't want to go too off the rails on Taliesin, but that story is an important part of the Cerridwen myth. Now, Cerridwen is mentioned in other places. Now, they said, now this goes back to Wikipedia here. It says the name Cerridwen occurs in the Black Book of Carmarthen. And this was from, let's see if it says when that was, what you call it? I want to say that one was 6th or 7th century. I could be wrong about that. And I'm trying to remember where I saw that piece of information because I don't want to tell you the wrong thing. Yeah, I'm looking at the etymology there. Yeah, that it's, and they think that the name translates, Sir Ifor Williams translates it as crooked woman. Though the precise meaning of the stems of the name, translated as crooked or bent, is uncertain. So they said it could also come from the adjective Gwen, meaning fair, beloved, blessed, or sacred. Okay. So there's so it could mean fair woman, but they often treat her as quote unquote crooked because she is somebody who has great magical skill, and of course magicians are always aligned with tricksters. One place you see this, one obvious place you see this in the archetypes is in the tarot, when you have the card number, the first major arcana card is the magician, but sometimes is also referred to as the juggler. Again, seen to be kind of a trickster figure. I mean, the Fool is also a kind of trickster figure too, and that's the 0 card. But so it's almost like the magician is more like the things of the ideas of the Fool, or the follies of the Fool, or fancies made manifest. So it's so in any case, there's this interesting, the mention of Cerridwen is not limited to the tale of Taliesin. So let's see. Okay, some later things. It's suggested that Cerridwen appeared as a simple sorceress character in the tale of Taliesin. Its earliest surviving text dates from the mid-16th century, but appears to be, from its language, a 9th century composition. So this would be the 800s, according to Hutton. References to Cerridwen are found in the work of the 12th century Gagenfurth, or Poets of the Princes, and I'm not sure I'm saying that right. I'm doing my best with what I know about Welsh lettering, but I'm not sure it's right. But Poets of the Princes. He thus considers later derivative works. In them, Cerridwen is transformed from a sorceress into a goddess of poetry, making her more like Brige in that way, in the goddess Brige or Brigid. Citing this in a couple of other examples, this is Hutton. I'm trying to see which Hutton it is. Oh, it's Ronald Hutton. Okay, who's written a lot on paganism, witchcraft, and so forth, and probably has one of the better researched books on that topic. He proposes that Poets of the Princes that substantially created a new mythology, not reflective of earlier paganism. Okay, nonetheless, references to Cerridwen's cauldron are also to be found in some of the early mythological poems attributed to Taliesin. Okay. The Victorian poet Thomas Love Peacock also wrote a poem entitled The Cauldron of Cerridwen. Later writers identify her as having been a pagan goddess, speculating on her role in the supposed Celtic pantheon. John Rhys, in 1878, referred to the solar myth theory of Max Muller, according to which Guinevere and Cerridwen are dawn goddesses. And again, Charles Isaac Elton in 1882 referred to her as a white fairy. Robert Graves later fitted her into his concept of the threefold goddess, in which she was interpreted as a form of the destructive side of the goddess. In Wicca, Cerridwen is a goddess of change, rebirth, and transformation, and her cauldron symbolizes knowledge and inspiration. Okay, well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. There's just no historical paganism in that. I mean, unless you count history from the time that Wicca became a religion. I had practiced Wicca for many years, And when I initially did, which was at the end of the 1980s, that there wasn't a whole lot of information available. There was Starhawk's book, there was Margot Adler's book, there was the works of Gerald Gardner, Doreen Valiente, and all the different permutations there. Ray Buckland, Janet and Stuart Farrar. There was all different writers at that time. Not as much as you see today on Wicca. Once it sort of became a more popular kind of phenomenon through TV shows and other things, and perhaps people, children now having parents who are probably maybe in my generation who started practicing Wicca and raised their kids that way. So, there's different places that this may have come from. But I remember at the time thinking that Wicca, because they were told it's the world's oldest religion, and they always referred back to Dr. Margaret Murray, who, of course, later her work was proven to be fraudulent. And Robert Graves, when I teach mythology, we teach different theories of myth, and one of them is called the myth and ritual theory. And basically, people who are proponents, or scholars, I should say, who have been proponents of that theory, believe that mythology comes as an explanation for a ritual, which to me, okay, pardon me if I'm missing something here, but that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. It's just kind of like, you do a ritual every day and you're like, hey, let's make up a story to go with this. More than likely you're repeating a ritualistic action that reflects something that may have been started a long time ago, or is a tradition that was parroted from a story for a long time ago. In other words, it's probably more the reverse, that there's some kind of story or accepted narrative about something to which the ritual refers, not the other way around. So I don't know. I've read Robert Graves. I remember reading the introduction to his book on the Greek myths, and he has a very, very strange definition of myth. And I don't want to sidetrack into Graves, but you'll find that at the best, if you want to read his work, if you like his work, I would simply say take it with a grain of salt, because there's some questionable scholarship behind it. That's the nicest thing I can say. My general take on Graves is actually far less nice, but I'm trying to be generous to people who have read him and maybe have gotten something out of him that they find useful. But I don't particularly care for Graves any more than I care for the matriarchal theory of the world that, which I've gone over. And if you haven't heard my podcasts on that, just to summarize very quickly, it's this idea that, at one time everybody worshipped the mother goddess and they were so peaceful and everything was so nice and la da 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 da. And then these terrible warriors came sweeping down from the Aryan north and subjugated everybody and brought their war gods and everything. And now we're all patriarchal, and isn't that terrible? That's my very flippant reinterpretation of it. And I do talk about this, not to continually be reselling my book here, Death and the Maiden, but I do go into a lot of detail about that, about this whole idea, which I don't think anybody else has really written about, this feminine connection to the underworld and what's associated with it in the same way that I have. So really, I'm referring to one of the only sources that kind of brings that together. But great, yeah. But as I explained in my introduction, there's really no evidence for that having ever been the case. Sure, they worshipped goddesses. Whether they worshipped goddesses and no gods, we don't really know. Cynthia Eller's book on the prehistory of the matriarchy, she kind of, I've heard some critiques of that work, but she more or less points out that there's really, that the evidence that they show to say, this is evidence that that they worship the Great Mother or whatever. It's really up for interpretation. It's like any archaeological thing. We can't say exactly, yes, this is what this meant to these people. We don't know that. And some of the evidence is also not what we think it is. So, the Jane Harrisons and the George Frasers and the Robert Graves, they have a theory of myth that, while sometimes there's interesting components to it, as a serious academic theory, it really doesn't hold any water. So, and my big argument against the myth of the matriarchy is matriarchal cults were not peaceful. They did human sacrifice. They whacked people's genitals off. It was not. I mean, that's, you know, and I'm not saying that to, you know, that's just the way. It was very kind of a bloody kind of a cult. You know, because you made those sacrifices back to the Earth Mother. And so it's, you know, and again, it's not that, you know, obviously goddess worship has changed over the years. It still doesn't do that. But, you know, these original cults of Kibali and Ma and some of these other, you know, these cults, they're these kind of like violently ecstatic cults that involve this kind of stuff. You know, so it's not, you know, so to me, just to say that it's like, you know, that women, and also that makes the suggestion that women by nature automatically, you know, they're just peaceful and passive and nurturing. And if anything, I think what I've been trying to prove in this podcast is that isn't necessarily so. I mean, that doesn't mean that those aren't nice qualities to have and cultivate, but, you know, to say that that's what it, quote unquote, what it is or what it should be is not quite accurate. Okay, I think I've digressed on that for too long. Let's go back to Cerridwen. So as we can see, there's the main story of her comes from the Mabinogion, and, you know, and it doesn't portray her as a goddess. It portrays her as a sorceress, of somebody with great magical power, who, for all we know, might also be a goddess. And, you know, and the way that this is translated and the date of it definitely are already into the Christian era. So if Cerridwen has been around longer than that, and there is every reason to believe that she was, again, you've got this kind of Christian rewrite. It's the same problem we have with the Morrigan and some of these other deities, is that the tales we have are probably Christian reinterpretations and Christian rewrites. Okay, certainly the whole saga of Arthur comes out of that era and takes that assumption. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about in this podcast was the idea of Cerridwen and the cauldron, because the idea of the cauldron is a very, very important one. It's the cauldron, it's the vessel, it's the Grail. Some people even have said that that's what King Arthur was actually going after, this holy Grail of knowledge and inspiration. I was recently rewatching. I rewatch it every now and again just because I get to look at Avebury, which is one of my favorite places in the world. But I was watching Children of the Stones. If you've not seen that series, and I have touted it elsewhere, so my apologies if I'm repeating myself here, but it's very, when I look at it in terms of the Cauldron of Cerridwen, it takes on a new meaning for me, because you see all of these sort of mindless people and children wandering around. And, you know, you have Adam Brake, who's the scientist, and his son Matthew. He's an astrophysicist coming to measure the magnetism of the stones. And they're there, and what they can see is that the majority of townspeople are very, very weird. They walk around like, happy day, and they you know, there's something about them that's almost robotic and inhuman. You know, they're always very pleasant and very nice, but there's something off. And one of the things they discover is that there's a dish, you know, under the ground, and it's kind of a curved dish, which would remind one of a vessel or a grail. Now, they don't bring that up, but it seems clear that, because Dai, the poacher, mentions at one point that they are, you know, who's one of the ones who's not affected by this, but he's fearful of it, because he kind of, in some way, intuits what's going on. He says, there's a treasure here in the center, and the greatest treasure of all, which is knowledge. And of course that's represented because these kids are all brilliant mathematicians and everything. They're like, 7 years old and doing like these calculus problems that are, I mean, it's, but that was the kind of idea that this was the great, and I'm thinking of that. I'm like, wow, there's like a cauldron underground that acts as like a receiver for the Ursa Major, which is also a feminine archetype, the Great Bear. Is bringing that knowledge and inspiration energy. So I thought about that recently. I thought, that's kind of interesting. If you haven't seen that series, it is worth watching. Okay, so that's okay. I want to talk a little bit about this story of Cerridwen. I want to do a little more interpretation here. With regard to the vessel and the other pieces, it's mentioned here that this is okay. The legend is heavy with instances of transformation. When she's chasing Gwion, the two of them change in any number of animal and plant shapes. Following the birth of Taliesin, Cerridwen contemplates killing the infant but changes her mind and instead throws him into the sea. That's kind of the basis of the hero myth, too, by the way. The heroic child who is a threat but then is like, or something, and then ends up being thrown into the water in a basket or a bag or something, where he's rescued by Celtic prince Elfin. Because of these stories, change, rebirth, and transformation are all under the control of this powerful Celtic deity. Stories of Cerridwen found within the Mabinogion are actually the basis for the cycle of Arthurian legend. Talisin becomes a bard in the court of Elfin, and then he's captured by the Welsh king Maelgwn. Taliesin challenges Maelgwn's bards to a contest of words, and it's his eloquence that frees Elfin from his chains. In the Celtic legend of Bran the Blessed, the cauldron appears as a vessel of wisdom and rebirth. Bran, the mighty warrior-like god, obtains a magic cauldron from Cerridwen in disguise as a giantess who's expelled from a lake in Ireland. And by the way, her dwelling is a lake, which kind of connects her in a way to the Lady of the Lake. But again, this idea of water, the vessel, we always think of that, again, in tarot symbolism, you see that the cups or the vessels, that's for the suit of water. And also, by the way, I should note that one of the entrances to the underworld, now I'm not entirely sure in the Celtic, though I think this is certainly possible. Usually, yes, and in fact, I can actually say that some of them are, that caves are the entrance. Caves that, run through water or caves that are under a lake. In Greek mythology, there are at least 4 entrances to Hades, and they're all in caves or they're around lakes. So there's that underworld connection. Bran, the mighty warrior god, obtains a magic cauldron from Cerridwen. Okay, and that represents the other world in Celtic lore. The cauldron can resurrect the corpse of dead warriors placed inside of it. Bran gives his sister Branwen and her new husband Mat, the king of Ireland, the cauldron as a wedding gift, but when war breaks out, Bran sets out to take the valuable gift back. He has a band of loyal knights with him, but only 7 return home. And Bran is wounded in a foot by a poisoned spear, another theme that recurs in the Arthur legend, found in the legend of the Fisher King, which I think I talk about elsewhere. And in some versions of the story, Bran marries Anna, daughter of Joseph of Arimathea, who was the one who's supposed to have brought the Grail to those islands. And also, like Arthur, only 7 of Bran's men return home. Bran travels after his death to the otherworld, and Arthur makes his way to Avalon. There are theories among some scholars that Cerridwen's cauldron, the cauldron of knowledge and rebirth, is in fact the Holy Grail. Okay. Yeah, and there was some other things that I had seen too. There's an article that I found it's called A Confluence of Wisdom, Symbolism of Wells, Whirlpools, Waterfalls, and Rivers in Early Celtic Sources. I'll have to put this source in the description for this below. But the author here, let's see if I have her name, because it's not right on the top here. Sharon Pace McLeod. Okay. And I had what I was about to cite to you was at the very, very end. So now I have to find it. Okay. I'm looking at her conclusions because she talks about Cerridwen, talks about Cerridwen's cauldron, not saying anything that we haven't already just said. But also a number of other instances in Celtic mythology in particular where wells, lakes, whirlpools, rivers, where, they serve a very specific mythological purposes. And she sums up here, in conclusion, evidence from a variety of literary and ethnographic sources suggests that bodies of water were physically and metaphorically associated with creation and destruction, healing and transformation, the acquisition and manifestation of divine wisdom and poetic skill. The archetypal scenario suggested focuses on an underworld well of wisdom. And I'm just going to stop there for a moment and remind you what I said in the last podcast and several others about the idea of the dead in the underworld having prophetic powers. One of the first places we see this is in the Odyssey, in the chapter called the Nicaea, where Odysseus goes and does a necromantic ritual to bring Tiresias, to feed him blood so that he can... his spirit can come back and tell him how to get home. Okay. Prophesize for him. Okay. So it's focused on underworld well of wisdom, which was believed to be the source or origin of these powers. So yeah, it's believed to come from the water. Sites where the water bubbled to the surface of the earth, wells, springs, rivers, etc., were considered a potent sanctified locations where inhabitants of this world might gain access to the powers of the other world. Yeah, and also, if we think about the old Oracle of Apollo at Delphi, again, I'm comparing it to the Greek, but the site of Delphi was where Apollo went and he killed the python, by this one spring of water. So yeah, so that's water or spring element is very important. The varied attributes and powers of the waters flowed through the realms of humankind by way of various streams and rivers in the inner and outer landscape. These powers seem to have intensified where they congregated in whirlpools or rushed over the edge of earth in waterfalls or cascades. The symbol of the vessel or cauldron plays an important role in many of these scenarios, as did the hazel of knowledge or the salmon of wisdom, which I didn't get into because those are different myths. But throughout the tradition, the illuminating power known as Imbos seems to have exercised a particularly important function, suggesting that this power, like so many others, traced its ultimate origin to the Celtic otherworld realms. So, yeah, so this idea of the cauldron, we definitely can look at Cerridwen as a kind of liminal figure. She's a boundary figure. Because, as most magicians are, because they set their foot in both worlds in the way that a shaman does. And as you see from the tale of her, she does have this knowledge of herbs and everything that we associate with witchcraft. And in certainly Old Testament, well, I shouldn't say Old Testament, but things like the Book of Enoch, for example, the skills of dealing with all of the means of casting spells or doing magical operations or using herbs to heal or things like that was certainly taught by the angels to the women who they fell in love with and made love to and produced the Nephilim as a result, which are the race of giants. And there's some similarity here too, because you see in this story, you see when Taliesin is born, he's sort of this extraordinary prodigy. He's sort of the product of these 3 drops of inspiration and Cerridwen herself. So he becomes sort of a super being in his own way. And so there's this, so there's this liminal quality to her that really does seem to link her to all these other things. And it's interesting that Wicca connects her to the destructive element. Although again, they're looking at her more as an old wise crone. I think that's really where that comes from. But the idea of wisdom as being connected to destruction. I suppose, though, if you think about it, innocence is also connected to children, or the childbirth. To me, Taliesin looks like the perfect example of the child archetype. He is knowledgeable, he is powerful, he is, as Jung would say, the past, present, and future. He represents potential, he represents hope, he represents abundance. Just as when the child image appears in our dreams and in things like that, it usually appears as a sign of hope and a sign that will, that's meant to show us opportunity and the way forward. There could be a sense of rebirth there, starting anew, which also you could associate with Cerridwen. So, to me, in a way, she's more associated with the divine child than she is with this sort of hag archetype. But here's an interesting place to see where both kind of work together, or maybe in some ways, the way in which creation or new life and destruction and death are really mirror sides of each other. It's not. They're not enemies of each other. They're not in opposition to each other. Cerridwen, and of course the cauldron, there's also that image of the pot in which you mix differing elements to come up with something new. So this idea of the vessel, if you remember, when I was growing up, when we would talk about the United States and the kind of immigration that we had, they would always refer to U.S. as a melting pot. And then later they decided that they liked the salad bowl metaphor better because, everything retains its own distinct quality, but yet, we're all mixed together in one society. Whereas the melting pot suggests we all lose our characteristics and become something different. And I don't know, maybe both are true in their own way. But yeah. that idea of the pot that, you know, so there's definitely, yeah, there's that metaphor of destruction, but I think that's too limiting. I think it's also, I think she's a metaphor for that new birth that can occur, and that new opportunity to do something right. I mean, why does she do this to begin with? She does this because, you know, she knows her son is not going to be accepted socially, so she's doing something for him to give him something to compensate for what he wasn't born with. To me, there's not. I don't know. I don't see her as destructive in that element. I don't see a whole lot in her mythology that makes her destructive. I think kind of making her into the that dark mother. I mean, yeah, there's the dark mother element, but suggesting that she's got a part of the destructive element. I don't know. I think, you know, the destructive element is mixed in with the creative one. I guess that's what I would say about that. So, okay, that's all I want to say about Cerridwen, because that's the main story of her, and without going too heavily into the Arthurian legend or some of these other stories, you know, I think it's probably fair to stop there. I want to thank you for listening again. Thanks very much to my patrons, my Patreon supporters, and if you want to join them and support me at patreon.com/Cathonia, I would very much be appreciative. I'm trying to do more and more with this work. I still work kind of in a limited purview here, so the more that I can expand out and do more with better equipment and, you know, some other things, that would be wonderful. And if not, I mean, well, even if you subscribe to Patreon or not, please do check out Cathonia.net, my site that has all of my, not only my podcast work, but my publications. And also right now, that is the main link to make appointments with me for tarot or Reiki or similar services. Check it out. I'm going to have a whole new website. I have a liminalreiki.com website that's been taken down for the moment, but there's a whole new one that's going to be built, so I'll have more information about that. In fact, by the time you listen to this podcast, it may already be out. So for information on everything, please check out my social media, Cathonia on YouTube, and on Cathonia Podcast, 2 words on Facebook, one word on Twitter and Instagram, and all new announcements will go there and on Cathonia.net. Thanks very much again for listening. Until next time.